I was in a coffee shop yesterday, and the woman at the table next to me was scrolling through the news on her phone. She was completely absorbed. You could see the look of genuine concern, even sadness, on her face as she read an article about a bombing in the Middle East. She shook her head, locked her phone — it was one of those brand new top-of-the-line models — and put it down on the table next to her laptop and the keys to her electric car. Just a normal person, taking in the weight of the world's problems. And it struck me, the profound, invisible connection sitting right there on the table. That phone, that laptop, the battery in that car, they all run on minerals like coltan and cobalt. And the story of where those minerals come from is a story that almost never makes it onto that newsfeed. It's the story of a conflict that has killed an estimated 5.4 million people, making it the deadliest since World War II. A conflict where right now, in the places those minerals are dug up, UNICEF reports a child is raped every half hour. And yet, compared to the tragedy she was reading about, the world is almost completely silent. It's a silence that's so total, so pervasive that you have to start asking why. Why is the deadliest war of our time a secret?
That paradox is exactly it. The sheer scale of the suffering in the Democratic Republic of Congo, I mean, directly fueling the technology we all use every single day.
Mm-hmm.
That's really what we need to unpack in this deep dive.
Right.
Our mission, if you like, is to investigate the why behind that silence you mentioned. Because it's not just some distant regional fight.
No.
It's clearly a systemic failure. You've got deep colonial history tangled up with massive modern demand for resources, geopolitics. And then there's this really inconsistent international engagement that seems to prioritize, well, access over actual stability.
And when we talk about the scale, those numbers, they're almost impossible to really comprehend, aren't they? We mentioned the estimate 5.4 to maybe 6 million deaths since 1996. That covers the First and Second Congo wars and just decades of simmering, ongoing unrest.
Yeah, the human cost is just staggering. It's on a scale that, frankly, few conflicts since the 1940s have even approached.
And crucially, this isn't just historical context. This is happening right now.
Exactly. This is today's reality. The DRC is facing one of the largest, most intense humanitarian crises anywhere in the world right now. You've got over 7 million people internally displaced, forced from their homes, often moving again and again, ending up in these awful makeshift camps with basically nothing.
7 million. That's like the entire population of what, Arizona? Just constantly on the move.
Pretty much. And if you look at the total need, it's 21 million people inside the DRC who need urgent aid.
21 million?
Yeah, that's almost a quarter of the whole country needing help with medicine, food, shelter, just to get through the day.
And the latest figures suggest it's getting worse, not better. There was new UN data, right, for early 2024.
That's right. First quarter of 2024 showed a 30% increase in grave violations against children compared to just the last quarter of 2023.
30%. That's terrifying.
It tells you that whatever systems are supposed to be protecting people, they're failing.
Yeah.
And they're failing faster than help can possibly arrive.
And the crisis ripples outwards from the immediate violence, doesn't it? Affecting food, health.
Oh, absolutely. The long-term fragility is just devastating. You've got catastrophic food insecurity affecting 23.4 million Congolese.
More than the population of Florida facing extreme hunger.
Exactly. And layered on top of that, the conflict is actively making a huge cholera epidemic worse. We're seeing, nearly 60,000 infections, over 1,500 deaths reported. And that's partly because aid workers, health workers, they often can't even get to the areas affected because of the fighting.
So let's talk about the fighting. Who are the main actors driving this, particularly in the East?
Well, the current sort of focal point is the March 23 movement, M23 they're called.
M23.
They're the main group in this latest escalation. But M23 isn't just some random militia appearing out of nowhere. They're really the latest version of a long line, decades long actually, of militant groups widely seen as backed by Rwanda.
Backed by Rwanda. Oh.
And they're fighting for territory, yes, but crucially, for access to the resources, the valuable minerals in eastern DRC, particularly the Kivu provinces, right there on the border with Rwanda.
And there was that major escalation early 2025 involving Goma. That was significant.
Hugely significant. Goma is the main city, the regional hub in North Kivu, right on the border. When M23 captured it, it wasn't just a military victory. It forced thousands, tens of thousands of people who'd already fled there for safety to flee all over again.
And the Rwandan involvement was pretty direct in that offensive, wasn't it?
Very direct. Our sources confirm Rwanda supported that M23 push on Goma with a substantial number of troops on the ground. Somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 Rwandan soldiers actively involved.
Wow. So not just funding or arming a proxy, actual boots on the ground.
That's right. It's state-level involvement, which really throws the regional rivalry between Kinshasa, the DRC capital, and Kigali, Rwanda's capital, into sharp relief.
What are the accusations they're throwing at each other? What's the official line from each side?
Well, Kinshasa is pretty blunt. They accuse Kigali of backing M23 purely for the money, for the financial stake in controlling mineral routes and getting profits from Congolese mines.
Okay, so an economic motive, fundamentally.
That's the accusation. Kigali, on the other hand, flatly denies this. Their public justification is security. They claim they have to act because Kinshasa supports Hutu extremist militias.
Specifically the FDLR.
Yes, the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, the FDLR. Groups descended from those who carried out the 1994 genocide in Rwanda.
So Rwanda says it's about preventing another genocide, while DRC says it's about Rwanda stealing resources.
Essentially, yes. It's this incredibly complex knot. You've got resource-grabbing, deep ethnic grievances going back decades, and this long, bloody history where each side paints itself as acting purely in self-defense.
No, there have been international attempts to stabilize things. MONUSCO, the UN mission, has been there for ages. But it's faced a lot of criticism. Why?
Yeah, MONUSCO's role has been really controversial. For many Congolese people, especially in the East, the mission has been seen as, well, ineffective, particularly when it comes to protecting civilians from these militia attacks that just keep happening.
People felt the UN wasn't actually keeping them safe.
That was the perception, yes. And it led to huge protests, sometimes violent ones, against MONUSCO and against intervention generally. The feeling was basically, you're here, but the violence hasn't stopped, so what good are you doing?
And that public anger actually forced the UN to plan a withdrawal?
It did. The pressure mounted, the DRC government formally requested it, and the UN Security Council agreed to a planned, phased drawdown.
But then they reversed course.
Well, that's the paradox, isn't it? As soon as the withdrawal was announced, the immediate fear became the security vacuum it would create. Pulling out too fast could leave millions completely exposed, especially with M23 on the offensive.
So they had to delay the withdrawal they'd just agreed to.
Exactly. They ended up extending MONUSCO's mandate through the end of 2024, trying to manage this slow, careful drawdown. It's a massive challenge, especially since other regional forces, like those from the East African community, had already pulled out.
It sounds like a total catch-22. Criticized if they stay, potentially catastrophic if they leave too quickly.
It really illustrates the fragility, and it shows why diplomatic efforts, even things like U.S. brokered pacts like the one in late 2023 trying to get Kinshasa and Kigali to de-escalate, just seem to fall apart almost instantly.
Because they're treating symptoms, not the root cause.
Precisely. These pacts might talk about reducing troop presence or hate speech, but they don't address the deep, embedded historical and economic drivers. To really get why these rivalries are so toxic and persistent, you have to go back to the colonial-era, particularly in Rwanda, next door.
Okay, let's go there. Before the Europeans arrived, with Rwandan society already rigidly divided between Hutu and Tutsi.
No, not in the way we think of ethnic groups today. This is really crucial. Pre-colonial Rwanda had groups Hutu, Tutsi, Twa, but they were more like occupational categories. They shared the same language, the same culture, mostly the same religion.
So the lines weren't fixed.
Not at all. The distinctions were fluid. Someone identified as Hutu could, through acquiring wealth, usually cattle, become recognized as Tutsi, and sometimes the other way around. The whole idea of separate inherited ethnicities was basically imposed from the outside.
Imposed by the colonial powers, first Germany, then Belgium. How did they turn those fluid categories into these hard racial divisions?
They used this really pernicious pseudo-scientific idea called the Hamitic hypothesis. It was a racist theory popular in 19th century Europe.
The Hamitic hypothesis, what did it claim?
It basically argued that anything civilized found in Africa must have originated from outside, usually from supposedly superior Hamitic peoples, maybe from Egypt or Ethiopia. So when European colonizers encountered the Tutsi minority in Rwanda, who were often taller, maybe slightly lighter-skinned, and traditionally cattle herders, about 14% of the population, they latched onto this.
They decided the Tutsi weren't really African.
Essentially, yes. They spun this myth that the Tutsi were descendants of these superior, non-indigenous Hamites, destined by race to rule.
Wow. And the Hutu majority.
The Hutus, who were mainly farmers, about 85% of the population, were classified as the indigenous, racially inferior Bantu stock.
So this wasn't just an academic theory. It had real-world consequences.
Devastating consequences. On one hand, it massively inflated the status and, you could say, the ego of the Tutsi minority, telling them they were born rulers. On the other hand, it systematically denigrated the Hutu majority, embedding this deep sense of resentment and, well, an inferiority complex that was hammered home for decades under colonial rule.
And the Belgians particularly put this theory into practice administratively, right? How did they actually structure society based on this?
Through a system of indirect rule. Both the Germans, and especially the Belgians, ruled through the existing Tutsi monarchy and Tutsi chiefs. They systematically shut Hutus out of positions of power, political, military, administrative.
It wasn't just a preference, it was policy.
Absolutely. By 1959, just before independence, the statistics were stark. 43 out of 45 of the main chiefs were Tutsi. This wasn't accidental. It ensured the Hutu majority felt oppressed not just by distant Europeans, but directly by a Tutsi elite propped up by colonial power.
And other institutions like the Catholic Church reinforce this.
Yes, unfortunately, the church often played a role. Influential figures within the church tended to view the Tutsi elite as more intelligent, more receptive to Christianity and progress.
Really?
There are records showing church officials expressing concern if too many Hutu children were admitted to mission schools, preferred to educate the sons of Tutsi chiefs. This helped solidify that narrative of Tutsi superiority.
So you have the ideology, the political structure, but the thing that really locked it in place was the identity cards, wasn't it?
That was the administrative masterstroke, if you can call it that, the point of no return. In 1933-34, the Belgians conducted a census and introduced mandatory ethnic identity cards, Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa.
And once you had that card,
that was it. Your identity was fixed. And crucially, it was made patrilineal, inherited from your father. You couldn't change it. This was vital for the colonizers because, honestly, telling Hutu and Tutsi apart physically was often impossible, despite their theories.
So if they couldn't always tell by looking, how did they decide who got which label on that first ID card back in 1933?
This is where it gets truly absurd and exposes the arbitrariness of it all. They often fell back on an economic measure, the notorious 10-cow rule.
10 cows?
Yes. If a man was deemed to own 10 or more cattle, he was classified as Tutsi on his ID card, regardless of his actual ancestry or appearance. Fewer than 10 cows. He was labeled Hutu or Twa.
So your lifelong, legally defined ethnic identity, determining your place in the colonial hierarchy, could literally depend on how many cows you owned on one specific day in 1933.
Exactly. A wealth assessment by a Belgian administrator became a fixed, inherited destiny for generations. It's chilling.
And this rigid system, built on lies and cows, laid the groundwork for the horror of 1994.
Directly. The 1994 Rwandan genocide was this incredibly rapid, planned extermination. The Hutu power elite organized it, but it was carried out by huge swaths of the Hutu population against their Tutsi neighbors, and also against moderate Hutu who opposed the killing. An estimated 800,000 people murdered in about 100 days.
And the sources draw a really important distinction between this and, say, the Holocaust.
Yes, it's a crucial point. While the Nazi state directed the Holocaust in Rwanda, the killing was much more decentralized. It was often community-driven neighbors turning on neighbors with machetes, co-workers killing co-workers, fueled by decades of that manufactured hatred and dehumanization.
And the immediate aftermath of the genocide is what directly connects Rwanda's tragedy to the DRC's ongoing conflict.
Absolutely. When the Tutsi-led Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF, won the war and stopped the genocide, nearly 2 million Hutu refugees fled across the border into eastern DRC, which was called Zaire back then.
And that mass movement wasn't just civilians.
No. Critically, it included many of the Hutu extremists, the militia members, the genocidaires themselves, who had orchestrated and carried out the killings. Their arrival instantly destabilized the Kivu provinces in eastern Zaire DRC.
Giving the new RPF government in Rwanda the justification or the pretext to intervene militarily across the border.
Precisely. The new Tutsi-led government in Kigali argued, quite plausibly at first, that these Hutu extremist groups regrouping in Zaire posed an existential threat. That fear led to Rwanda's invasion in 1996, which kicked off the First Congo War.
So this conflict we see today, fueled by minerals, is fundamentally rooted in that spillover, that unresolved security crisis born out of Rwanda's colonial past and genocide.
That's the core regional driver. Now, let's pivot to the modern fuel that keeps this fire raging. The minerals themselves. The geopolitics of resources.
Right. The DRC is sitting on just vast reserves of minerals critical for modern technology. Smartphones, laptops, electric cars, you basically can't have them without Congolese minerals.
It's the uncomfortable truth. And we need to look at the two main supply chains here because they're different. Cobalt and coltan. They come from different regions, have different risks, but both are deeply tied into the conflict economy.
Okay, let's start with cobalt, sometimes called a 2C mineral. Where is that primarily found?
Cobalt comes mainly from the Copperbelt region in the southeast, DRC, provinces of Haut-Katanga and Lualaba. Geographically quite far from the M23 fighting in the Kivus, but absolutely central to the global EV boom.
And the DRC's dominance here is huge, right?
It's staggering. The DRC supplies something like 67%, two-thirds of all the world's cobalt. It's essential for the cathodes in lithium-ion batteries.
How is it mostly extracted? Is it small-scale miners or big companies?
It's overwhelmingly large-scale mining, LSM. About 70–80% of the cobalt production comes from these huge industrial mines. And, importantly, these big mines are often owned by massive Chinese companies. That's a key geopolitical factor we need to come back to.
Okay. So if it's mostly large industrial mines, does that mean the main risks are different from the conflict minerals narrative we often hear? Less about militias funding themselves?
Yes, the risk profile shifts. With cobalt, the biggest documented issue isn't so much direct conflict financing by militias, but rather massive, high-level corruption and state capture.
Can you give an example? The scale of this corruption?
It's genuinely jaw-dropping. We're talking billions. The most notorious case involves an Israeli businessman, Dan Gertler, and the state-owned mining company, Gécamines.
Right, I've heard that name.
Estimates suggest the Tongolese state lost at least $1.95 billion just from deals involving Gertler and Gécamines. These were incredibly opaque deals, selling off mining rights and concessions to offshore shell companies at vastly undervalued prices.
Nearly $2 billion. Money that should have gone to schools, hospitals, roads.
Exactly, and that's just one prominent case. Other reports show that between 2013 and 2015 alone, $750 million in mining revenues that were supposed to go to Gécamines and government tax agencies just vanished, went unaccounted for.
So this high-level graft is systemic in the cobalt sector.
It seems to be the most frequently reported governance risk, yes. There are far more reports documenting these kinds of bribery and corruption scandals, 79 reports cited in one source, compared to only 19 for tantalum, which is more linked to the militia financing issue.
But that doesn't mean cobalt extraction is clean when it comes to human rights on the ground, does it? Especially where the big mines meet small-scale miners.
No, not at all. That intersection where LSM concessions bump up against areas where artisanal and small-scale miners, the ASM sector, are working is often incredibly violent.
Artisanal miners, these are individuals digging by hand.
Yes, often with basic tools, sometimes illegally on land claimed by the big companies. While LSM dominates the output volume, ASM still employs a huge number of people, maybe 20–30% of the workforce. And this leads to constant clashes.
Clashes over land access.
Exactly. There were repeated reports of LSM operators, like subsidiaries of major companies like Glencore, using private security or even state forces to violently evict artisanal miners from the land. People get hurt, killed even.
And cobalt is the sector most strongly associated with the terrible problem of child labor, right?
It is. That's the issue that gets the most attention from international consumers and NGOs, and rightly so. Older estimates, maybe from around 2012, suggested maybe 40,000 children were working in cobalt mining.
40,000?
While industry initiatives claim to be tackling this, child labor is still reported frequently. It's highly visible and attracts intense scrutiny, like 284 reports linking cobalt to child labor found in one review, compared to maybe 40 for coltan. For people buying EVs or electronics, this is often the most direct ethical connection they feel.
And what about the environmental cost in the Copperbelt?
It's huge, because unlike coltan mining, which is often remote, these massive cobalt mines and processing plants are frequently located near towns and cities in Katanga.
So the pollution directly impacts communities.
Terribly. You get extreme air and water pollution from mining waste, dust, processing chemicals. Some waste is even radioactive. It contaminates soil, drinking water, leading to severe long-term health problems.
Like what kind of health problems?
There are documented cases of cobalt lung, a serious, potentially fatal respiratory disease from inhaling cobalt dust. And studies have shown higher rates of birth defects in communities near these mining and refining sites. The cost of our clean energy transition is being paid right there in Congolese health.
Okay, let's shift to the other key mineral, coltan, one of the 3T's minerals, tantalum. This one is directly linked to the conflict in the east, in the Kivus.
Yes, coltan is critical for making capacitors, especially the tiny, high-capacity ones needed in smartphones, laptops, 5G technology. The DRC produces around 39% of the world's supply.
And unlike cobalt, how is coltan typically extracted?
It's the opposite profile. Coltan is primarily extracted through artisanal and small-scale mining, ASM, often in very remote, difficult-to-access areas, frequently under weak or non-existent government control. That's why it's so directly tied to the conflict dynamics involving groups like M23.
So if it's mostly small-scale, remote mining, what are the main risks in that supply chain?
The dominant risks become smuggling and resource predation, often by armed groups or corrupt officials. Smuggling is absolutely rampant.
Why is smuggling so prevalent?
Several reasons. The borders, especially with Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi, are incredibly porous and hard to monitor. There are also big price differences. Illicit buyers often pay more or pay faster than the formal channels, making the black market very attractive. And armed groups often control the mines or tax the routes.
And the evidence points towards Rwanda playing a key role in this illicit trade.
The evidence is pretty strong, yes. Rwanda itself mines very little coltan domestically, yet it has consistently been a major exporter of coltan onto the global market.
So the minerals are mined in DRC, smuggled into Rwanda, and then exported as if they were Rwandan.
That's what the data strongly suggests. It's a way to launder the minerals, hiding their conflict-ridden origin in the DRC. It points to, at minimum, complicity in this illicit trade at official levels.
How is the smuggling actually done? Is it sophisticated?
It ranges. Sometimes it's quite ingenious, hiding bags of coltan inside petrol tanks on motorbikes, stuffing it into spare tires, building false bottoms or secret compartments in trucks carrying other goods.
And bribes are just part of the cost.
Absolutely essential. Smugglers factor in the cost of bribing border guards, police, customs officials at multiple points along the route. It's a whole ecosystem built on corruption and evasion.
What about traceability schemes? Things like ITSCI, putting tags on bags to show they're from clean mines. Are they stopping this?
They're trying, but the system is seriously undermined by fraud. ITSCI is a major due diligence program where bags of minerals from validated conflict-free mine sites get a tag.
Sounds good in theory.
In theory. But what happens is, unscrupulous traders or middlemen can buy these legitimate ITSCI tags, sometimes on the black market, from corrupt agents. Then they slap these official tags onto bags of minerals that have actually come from conflict zones or mines controlled by armed groups or mines using child labor.
So the tag certifies the bag, but not necessarily the minerals inside. The system itself is being used to launder conflict minerals.
Precisely. It creates a veneer of legitimacy for minerals that are anything but clean. And beyond the conflict links, this ASM coltan mining in ETH also has a devastating environmental impact.
How so?
Because miners are often pushed into extremely remote areas, including protected national parks. There's documented destruction in places like Kahuzi-Biega National Park, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and critical habitat for the endangered eastern lowland gorilla. Mining activity pollutes rivers, causes deforestation. It's another layer of tragedy.
Okay, let's pull back now to the bigger picture. The international response, or lack thereof. Given the scale of human tragedy, given how vital these minerals are to us, why the silence? Why does the international community seem so apathetic or inconsistent?
It's a critical question, and looking at U.S. policy over time is quite revealing. There's a stark contrast.
How so?
During the Cold War, U.S. policy towards Congo, or Zaire as Mobutu called it, was actually very consistent for about 40 years. The goal was clear: support a strong, unified Zaire as a strategic bulwark against Soviet influence in Central Africa.
Regardless of Mobutu's own record.
Pretty much. Stability or perceived stability under a pro-Western strongman was the priority. The policy was coherent, long-term.
And after the Cold War?
That coherence completely evaporated. After the 1992 U.S. elections, the incoming Clinton administration signaled a shift away from supporting dictators like Mobutu. Security assistance was cut. But then, when the country desperately needed support for its fragile democratic transition in the mid-90s, and especially when the war started in 96, the U.S. essentially disengaged, left it adrift.
Abandoned it just when it needed help most.
That's how it looks. And it wasn't just neglect. Some policy circles in the West, according to sources, actually started seeing the crisis almost as an opportunity, a chance to perhaps break up the vast Congo into smaller, supposedly more manageable countries.
Wait, really? There were people actively considering or even encouraging the country's fragmentation.
The sources suggest that viewpoint existed, tolerating or even implicitly encouraging regional neighbors to exert influence over parts of Congolese territory, particularly the resource-rich East.
So U.S. policy shifted from long-term stability to short-term interests.
Exactly. The focus became very narrow. Immediate security threats, counterterrorism, or ensuring access to minerals, but without that sustained long-term commitment to actually strengthening the Congolese state itself, its judiciary, its security forces, its civil society. The long game was abandoned.
And that created a vacuum.
A massive strategic vacuum. And China stepped right into it, playing a very different, very consistent long game.
How has China's approach differed?
China has maintained relatively consistent engagement since the 1960s, regardless of who was in power in Kinshasa. This allowed them, especially in the last 20 years, to capitalize massively on the weak governance and instability.
Capitalize how?
By securing unparalleled access to the mineral wealth. Chinese companies now control the majority of foreign-owned mines for cobalt, uranium, copper in the DRC. They've established something close to a monopoly on these absolutely critical resources.
What does that Chinese dominance mean strategically, for instance, for the U.S. goal of boosting clean energy and EVs?
It's a huge obstacle. China's near monopoly on cobalt in particular gives it enormous leverage in the global battery supply chain and the entire energy tech sector. It significantly hinders Western countries, including the U.S.'s, ability to control their own clean energy future and build secure supply chains. It's a major geopolitical choke point.
And China's involvement isn't purely economic, is it?
No. China is also a significant player in the conflict dynamics themselves. They are supplying the Congolese government, the FARDC, with military equipment, including drones and other weaponry, to fight rebel groups like M23.
Which complicates any peace efforts led by, say, the UN or the West.
Absolutely. It adds another layer of complexity, another major power with its own interests deeply embedded in the conflict.
This really highlights the limits of those Western-led due diligence efforts we talked about, like the Dodd-Frank Act for 3T minerals.
Yes, the experience with 3T regulation over the last decade taught some hard lessons. One key lesson was the disengagement risk.
Disengagement risk?
When you impose very strict traceability rules and mandatory compliance, sometimes the reaction from international companies isn't to clean up their supply chains, but simply to stop buying from that region altogether. They shift sourcing to places deemed safer or easier to certify.
Which hurts the very people it's supposed to help.
Exactly. It can devastate the livelihoods of legitimate artisanal miners who lose their market access, while the armed groups often just find other ways to sell their minerals on the black market or shift to other commodities.
And are we seeing signs of the same problem potentially repeating now with cobalt, with DRC's state-run buyer?
There's a real concern, yes. The Congolese government set up a state-owned company, the Entreprise Générale du Cobalt, or EGC, intended to formalize the artisanal cobalt sector and buy directly from miners.
Sounds like a good idea on the surface.
Maybe. But the way it was structured gave EGC a de facto monopsony.
Monopsony, meaning the only buyer.
Yeah, the sole legal buyer for all artisanal cobalt. And that creates huge risks.
Why is having only one legal buyer a problem if you're trying to stop illegal trade?
Because it removes all bargaining power from the miners. They have to accept the price EGC offers, take it or leave it. If the state buyer is inefficient, bureaucratic, pays slowly, or offers a price significantly lower than what smugglers on the black market are offering,
the miners will just sell illegally anyway.
Precisely. It creates massive mistrust. If EGC offers $5 a kilo and takes weeks to pay, while a clandestine trader offers $7 cash on the spot, which route do you think a poor miner trying to feed their family will choose? It risks driving more trade underground and increasing smuggling, potentially repeating all the problems seen in the 3T sector.
It's striking, looking at all these complex systems, the tags, the laws, the state buyers, how selective their focus often seems. You mentioned earlier the intense focus on child labor.
Yes.
But maybe less on the massive, high-level corruption.
That's a really critical observation. These responsible sourcing initiatives, driven largely by Western consumer and NGO pressure, understandably focus very heavily on the most visible, visceral human rights abuses like child labor, and tackling that is absolutely essential. But they often seem to lack the same explicit focus, the same transparency requirements when it comes to tackling the huge systemic financial crime, the billions lost to corruption involving state officials and international companies, like the Gertler case we discussed.
Why do you think that is? Is it just harder to track?
It's certainly more opaque, harder to document perhaps, but it might also be less comfortable territory, getting into high-level state corruption and the complicity of major international players. It's easier maybe to focus on cleaning up the mine site itself than tackling the offshore accounts and opaque contracts. But that corruption is a fundamental driver of the instability that allows those abuses to happen.
So the silence on corruption, combined with the geopolitical focus on just securing the minerals rather than building strong institutions, it all feeds back into why this conflict remains a secret war, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The crisis in the DRC isn't just some unfortunate, isolated regional tragedy. It's a system, a deeply entrenched economic machine.
A machine built from?
Built from the toxic legacies of colonial engineering that deliberately created ethnic divisions, fueled by regional power struggles born out of the aftermath of genocide, and kept running by massive, relentless global demand for the resources needed for the very technology you're probably using to listen to us right now.
And that machine is allowed to keep running because of inconsistent, often self-interested international engagement, a kind of selective silence, prioritizing getting the minerals out over ensuring the country is stable and governed accountably.
That's the core takeaway, really. The global rush for clean energy, for faster communications, for smarter devices, all the things we see as progress relies profoundly on minerals extracted in the midst of appalling violence, systemic corruption, and arguably the world's deadliest ongoing humanitarian crisis.
We are all connected to this silent war just by living our modern lives.
We are. And the silence surrounding it isn't an accident. In many ways, it's a necessary feature of the global supply chains that bring those minerals from a conflict zone in the Congo right into our pockets and homes.